Esther chapter 2. I wanted this week to kind of find out how children's Bibles would handle the book of Esther in chapter 2. So I rummaged through Ruth's classroom. Sorry if I left a mess, but I rummaged through Ruth's classroom looking at all of the, did you say you thought it was a mouse? No, it wasn't a mouse. I rummaged through Ruth's classroom looking for children's Bibles and what they say about Esther, specifically chapter 2 of Esther. And I found it doesn't say a lot. They kind of skip over the chapter altogether. It says things like, and then the king saw Esther's beauty and he married her, or he fell madly in love with her. And it's just so romantic, right? Just the whole chapter summed up in one sentence, because you don't want to get too deep into Esther chapter 2 because it presents some morally complicated situations that she finds herself in. And maybe that's not all that appropriate for kids' books. But there was some that described the chapter 2 of Esther as a beauty pageant. All these women lining up before the queen or the king, and they had the what is that? The thing that goes sash that goes around their shoulder, and they're performing their talents, trying to get picked by the king, and Esther is the most talented, the most beautiful, she wins. And so that was an interesting way of presenting the morally complicated situation that happens in chapter 2. Another one, I think this is why I went with the dream vacation question, is because it presented Esther chapter 2 as if it was a spa day. You know, the perfect vacation. You just go and sit there in the spa, and you have oil and perfumes and massages, and it was just such a beautiful day for Esther. And then after that, she was crowned queen. Beautiful story, right? Again, a little like simplistic for what's going on in chapter 2. Of course, it's supposed to be their children's Bibles. But that's not exactly how this chapter goes. In fact, what we find in this chapter is a woman who is an orphan and rising to the point of queen. From the very lowest of lows to the highest of highs. And so it's a very powerful chapter, but what she does, or what she is forced to do, or taken away to do, is really difficult for her. And so we're going to read about that today in this chapter. And I want to just start by going through the chapter. It starts out, verse 1 of chapter 2, talking about later. It says, later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he decreed about her. And so it's the first verse like pulls us back to chapter 1. And if you were here with us chapter 1, you know that we got a picture of a morally corrupt king, somebody who threw too many parties, drank too much, showed off all his extravagant lifestyle, the gold cups, and a bar that just wouldn't stop. And in his drunken state, he called his queen, Vashti, to come before her in a crown. And both Jewish tradition and Christian tradition say that the reason that she refused the request is because the request was for Vashti to come before him in only her crown. And so she refused to come to the party like that. And so she's stripped of her title as queen, and she can no longer step in the king's presence anymore. And what it tells us in that chapter is that when the king has a decree, that nothing can overturn it, right? And so when we get to chapter 2, he's looking back and he's remembering, because no longer is he angry, his fury's died down. He's remembering his queen. And I think he's feeling a little bit lonely, because in the Bible, when God remembers his people, that's when he wants to come to their aid or rescue them from exile. And so there's this idea that in Scripture, remembering has to do with longing and kind of wishing that he could have her back. But he can't, because this king is somebody who cannot make his own choices, but once he's made a decision or once he's issued a decree, he cannot turn it away, right? Like, it seems to be like he's reliant on his officials to come up with all of his plans. And then once a decree happens, that's it. Story's over. And so here's King Xerxes sitting in his temple, or the citadel of Susa, starting to wonder, like, well, I miss Vashti. He's remembering her. And so his officials come up with an idea. Here's what their idea is. It sounds like a brilliant plan, maybe. They say, let a search. By the way, this is verse 2. It says, the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for all the beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of the realm to bring these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, whom he is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them, and let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So again, you find the officials deciding, like, the king's sad. What are we going to do about this? So they decide to do a beauty search, right? Like maybe you think of like Americans Got Talent or something like that. Let's just go through the whole region and find the most beautiful young virgins, and let's have them come before the king, and the one that pleases him the most, that's going to be the one that we make queen. And of course, the king is excited about this prospect, right? And so that's the scene one. We see the king kind of remembering his wife and Vashti and longing for a new one, and so the search is made. They're going to have a virgin roundup, right? All the providence, bring them all together. In the next scene, verse 5, what we're introduced to is two new main characters in the book. We meet Mordecai, and we also meet Esther. And we find out some things about Mordecai and Esther, about their family background and who they are. So in verse 5, it says, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Right? So you have Mordecai. And we don't know what his Jewish name is. We only know his Persian name, Mordecai. But we do know his family story, right? He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and somewhere in his lineage, it makes it seem as if it's his grandfather, but in Jewish genealogies, often they'll skip generations. And so he's related to Kish. Who knows who Kish is? Nobody? Let's go back to Samuel. Well, you'll find out who Kish is in 1 Samuel chapter 9. And actually, you don't find out exactly who Kish is. You find out who his son is. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, it says, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish, son of Abel, the son of Zoror, the son of Bachareth, the son of Aphiah, of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome as a young man could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was the head taller than anyone else. Now, do you guys know who Saul is? Yeah, you know who Saul is. Mordecai is related to him, like in some way, right? Mordecai is related to him, and he must have just great genes, because do you see how it talks about the child of Kish? He is handsome and as a young man could be, right? He might have looked like my son, right? As handsome as a young man could be. That was Saul. And he's a head taller than anyone else. So I guess what we're starting to get at is a family line that goes way back to the Jewish people that just have beautiful children, right? Handsome and head taller. And of course, Mordecai might have been the same, but we know that Esther is going to be beautiful, right? Because of course she's beautiful. She's from the line of Kish, right? And so we meet Mordecai, and we find out something about him. But what we find out is that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. And so he belongs in Israel, but he's been taken away from his homeland and brought to Persia, where he's serving the king. And of course, he didn't go back when he was allowed to. He stayed there, and he's living in these two worlds. One, a very Jewish world, and that his family heritage is from the tribe of Benjamin, but also a very Persian world. And he's trying to navigate, like, how do I live in this world? The second main character we meet is a young lady, and her name is Esther. Now, of course, we know who Esther is, but that's not her Jewish name. In verse 7, it says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah. Have you guys ever heard Esther named Hadassah? Right? She has her name's Hadassah, who he had brought up, and because she had neither father or mother, this young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. So you see the tragic place where Esther comes from, right? She's taken in by Mordecai, her cousin. And she also follows that same family line. She's a child. She's related to Kish, so she's beautiful, right? And but she has this tragic life. Her father and mother had died, and her cousin Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. And you find Mordecai caring about her. the next scene, right? We've got the opening scene. This is the king. He's upset and lonely, and he wants to find a new queen. So they propose a plan. All the virgins are round up to be brought to the king. The one that pleases him the most, that's the one they'll choose. And then you have another scene where you're introduced to two main characters, Mordecai from the family line of Saul and Benjamin and Kish, and his cousin, Hadassah, also known as Esther, who is an orphan. Her father and mother had passed away, and she is taken in by Mordecai. What we find next is the roundup itself. In verse 8, what we find is the king's order and his edict had been proclaimed, and many young women were brought into the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Like, that's what happens. We have all these women from, by the way, if you remember from chapter 1, this King Xerxes had an empire that went from Ethiopia to India, and he brought all the beautiful virgins in from all the provinces. And they were to be brought in, and they had beauty treatments given to them, right? And they're put in the care of Haggai. You know, interesting side fact. Like, the first time in chapter 1, when we meet Xerxes, it's his 3rd year. By the time he marries Queen Esther, it's his 7th year. So there's 4 years of beautiful virgins being brought before him, right? Like, you think this guy's going to take his time finding a new queen? He's got 4 years of this. And Esther is round up with them, right? She's brought into the harem, and she's put into the charge of a man named Haggai, who the text says finds favor with her. And the way that it shows that he finds favor with her is he makes sure that she starts treatments right away. And he makes sure that she has special foods. And he makes sure that she has special servants. And he makes sure that she's got the best place in the harem. If you don't know what a harem is, it's the house of the wives the king would have, right? A house just for wives. I have trouble keeping one wife in my house. This guy had a house full of them, right? And Esther is taken. She's taken there. Next, we find out what happens with these women, right? Like, this is what happens. I just want you, as we think about this, just think of the identity change that might happen to these women, right? It's not a day at the spa. That's the romantic view. What happens in verse 8, it says, actually, I'm going to jump down to verse 12. What happens in verse 12, it says, before a young woman's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatment prescribed for the women, 6 months of oil and myrrh, and 6 months of perfume and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, she would return to another part of the harem to be cared for by Shegez, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So I know that maybe it doesn't jump out to you because the author's being a little bit cryptic in how he says it, but let's just think about this. These women were rounded up, maybe like cattle, rounded up and brought before the king, and then given 12 months of beauty treatments, oil and then perfumes. And then when it was her night to go, any woman's night, when it was their night to go before the king, they could take whatever items they wanted to bring. And they would go in before the king as a virgin. But when they left, they couldn't go back to the same house. Instead, they had to go to the house of the concubines. Now, that means when they showed up, they were a virgin. When they left, they were no longer. In fact, they were almost discarded, right? If the king doesn't remember their name or call them back to his presence, they would just live a life of loneliness because they couldn't go out of the harem of the palace, but they also couldn't see the king unless he remembered their name and called them. Like, just think of the identity change that would have brought to these women. They're no longer their own. Like, one night with the king takes a year preparation, and when that night is over, you're either going to be the queen or you're going to be lonely and alone, unable to have a family, like you might hope for a child from that one night because After that, you wouldn't get another chance. I mean, like I said, it took 4 years, right? From the time he gets angry with Vashti till the time he marries Queen Esther. And there's a new woman brought before the king every night. How many of you think he remembers their names? Right? Like there's 365 days in a year, right? Like 4 years this goes on. I doubt he's remembering very many of these ladies' names. And then, of course, it's Esther's turn. And this is the part where Esther shows up in verse 15. The term came for Esther, the young woman that Mordecai adopted and as his daughter and of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, and she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her, since she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen. And this king, he did what he does best. In verse 18, the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all the nobles and officials, and he proclaimed a holiday throughout the province and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Right? It's Esther's turn, and she comes before the king. She takes only what is suggested by Haggai, the one that was helping her prepare for all this. And when she comes before the king, she pleases him. She finds favor. And she doesn't leave a concubine. She leaves a queen. Right? That's most part chapter 2. We'll talk about the rest of it in a second. But as you guys can see, what I'm trying to show is that this is not like a fairy tale story. It's not a dream vacation where you have a year of cosmetics and oils and wasn't it great? It's not summed up in a simple chapter like or sentence like the children's Bibles do, where Esther was more beautiful and the king fell in love with her. There is nothing romantic about this. Do you guys agree? No, this is not romantic. In fact, it's a little bit vile. It's a little bit hard to read, but that's what it's like reading narratives in the Bible. It's telling you the things, and it's not telling you how to think about the things all the time. It's asking you to consider this story in the light of the rest of Scripture. And if you do that, you can't help but see the foolishness of the king. You can't help but see the complicated situation of Esther's life. And you can't help but see God working behind the scenes to bring about his purpose. And so I'm going to help you see that. My first point that I want to make tonight is the first picture we see. It's a picture of a morally corrupt king. Right? It's a picture of a morally corrupt king. And we talked about this last week, right? Chapter 1, he was shown to be an unwise king because he partied for 180 days, followed by another party of 7 days. He spent all his efforts trying to boast about himself and show off his possessions. It was like an episode of MTV Cribs or something like that. And then he treated people like property. He asked his queen to come in front of him while he was drunk, and invited her up to his party wearing only her crown. And then we see him making a foolish and rash decision that he's unable to do anything about later. He's an unwise king, but this chapter shows him is not just unwise, but maybe morally corrupt. Maybe somebody who is so interested in pleasing himself that he takes no value in people, right? And that's not the kind of leaders that we should look for, or leaders that we want to follow. We want to follow leaders that have a high regard for humanity and not look down on people as if they are playthings or property. And I want to show you just how this king does it. Look at his advisors know him so well. They know whenever he's remembering his queen and missing her, they know what to do to please him. And so verse 4 says, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king and he followed it. It's all about his pleasure, right? It's not about the character of the person. It's all about the pleasure of the king. It's any virgin who is beautiful, who is brought in front of him, who can please him. It's all about himself, right? That's not the only clue that shows that this is a morally corrupt king. These women had to sacrifice their life, their identity, who they were as people. They were ripped from their families and brought to the citadel of Susa. No longer did what they want in life or their own dreams and aspirations have anything to do with where their life was going to turn out. Instead, they had to spend 1 year in order to spend one night with the king. And then maybe be made queen, but most likely live on their own in loneliness. And that's a king who's morally corrupt because these people are playthings. They're not persons. They're his toys, right? Imagine, I think this is interesting just because it is kind of like described like a spa day, but it's not so relaxing. It says in verse 12, it says, before the young woman's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed by the women, or prescribed for women, 6 months of oil, 6 months of perfume and cosmetics. Like they found these oil and cosmetic things that these women would just have to lay on top of all day. Like everything about who they were was supposed to be about satisfying or the king. How they looked, how they smelt, how they felt, what they ate was not their own choice. It was how to satisfy the king. That's not a spa day. That's not a relaxing vacation. It's all about him. And in case you're thinking, well, this guy is just somebody who treats women like playthings, outside reports, not found in this book, but outside reports say the Persian Empire would take 500 young men every year and turn them into eunuchs to be used for their service. It wasn't just about women themselves, but anybody who served the king, their life had to be about that. Now, it would be easy to just judge this king, but we live in a different culture, in a different time, and that's kind of what life was like in the Persian Empire. But, Scripture tells us something about the value of people. Right? Regardless of the time, the Bible tells us that when God created us, he breathed life into us and he created us in his image. Both male and female were created in the image of God. That means there's something special and something unique and something different about you. You're set apart from every other thing on this planet. You are created in the image of God, and just that fact alone means that you have value and meaning regardless of age, race, gender, social class. I don't care what it is, you have value. Isn't that what happened on Pentecost? The Holy Spirit came and Peter said, this is to fulfill what God said through the prophet Joel. In the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Young men will dream dreams. Women will see visions. Like it was everybody. Just look at the list of languages. People from all over the world heard the message of the gospel that day, regardless of their ethnicity, they were just people. The gospel went out to people because everybody has value. And that's the age of the church. That's the age we live in today, where everybody has value. Although I would tell you that value was given to us at the very creation of man. We were created in God's image. Matthew chapter 10, I want to read that because this is what Jesus says about it. Now, in context, the disciples are Jesus is telling the disciples not to worry about what people can do to them, right? But worry about God. But in verse 29 of Matthew chapter 10, it says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of the Father's care. And even the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Like, I like to run. I like to look. Like, a lot of the time I've been running up Prison Hill, and there's a lot of wildflowers growing. And it's a beautiful, like right now it's beautiful. Most of the time it's just sagebrush, but it's still beautiful, just more beautiful right now. And I love to see the birds, like flying across, and I like to see the butterflies, things like that. Those are all beautiful things, like amazing things. But aren't you worth more? Didn't God create you with more value, meaning, and purpose? My second point is that it's a picture of a complicated orphan, right? We're going to see a picture of a conflicted orphan. This is more, Esther's life is described as being taken, right? Several times in the text, it'll use the term taken to describe. The first time it uses the term taken is in verse 7. It says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah who had been brought up because she had neither father or mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her in as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. Right? Like, this is somebody who took her in. And in that context, she's probably grateful that she was taken in by Mordecai, but not grateful that she had lost her father and mother. Not grateful that she was an orphan. And Mordecai loved her. The text talks about him going to the gate, right, or going to the citadel to check on her every day to make sure that she was okay. But I'm sure in those moments where she's asking God, like, why do you have to take my family? Why do I have to live as an orphan under Mordecai? See, these are all complicated situations. The next time she's described as being taken is later on in the chapter, whenever she's taken to the king, and that happens in verse 8. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai. I wonder what she felt about that moment. There she is. She's lost her father and mother, living with Mordecai, and now she's taken to the king, sentenced to either a life of loneliness or maybe an opportunity to be queen. She was taken. I think as I read a lot of the commentary, some people want to make Esther off to be a hero, right? She's obedient to Mordecai. She does what he asks out of her. She doesn't share her identity, and she hides it because she's obedient. And so they make her off to be a hero, the role model of all daughters, right? Other commentaries think that she's just a morally corrupt character. I mean, she assimilates to her culture in such a way that no one can tell that she's a Jew. She eats the food that is given to her. Everybody praises Daniel because he doesn't. She beds the king, and then she marries somebody that the law says that she shouldn't, right? And now, if you want to make her out to be a hero, you'll say, well, she didn't have a choice in all that. But then those same people will also praise all the people throughout Scripture that refused and ended up being persecuted or thrown into a lion's den because they refused, right? So there's no way of looking at this life saying this is one that's either heroic or one that is morally corrupt. What I would say is this is a life that's tragic. This is a life of a woman who is taken, and she's trying to figure out how to live in a complicated world. And she's doing the best that she can. And maybe you disagree with some of the decisions that she makes, or maybe you agree with them, but they're still her decisions. She's stuck in this complicated world trying to navigate her way through it. Does anybody identify with that? We're all kind of living in a Babylon or a Persia today. We're asked to live in America, and sometimes we have to assimilate, and sometimes we can't assimilate, and sometimes we have to stand out. What is it that we're supposed to do? The book of Romans tells us that we shouldn't be conformed to the patterns of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Romans chapter 12, right? We live in a difficult time where it's hard to know sometimes what the right thing to do is. The beautiful thing about that is that God will use us, our good and bad choices, to bring about his purposes. And that's what I see when I see Esther. The last point I want to make, and I'm sorry I'm going over, the last point I want to make is that the picture of the divine favor in the life of Esther, right? Like, one of the things that's going to stand out in this chapter is the word favor and how often the word favor is used to describe her life. The first time it's used is in verse 9 when it says she pleased him. This is talking about Haggai, right? She pleased him and won his favor. We might wonder, what does that mean to win his favor? It means for her that immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food and assigned her 7 female attendants and selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. She stood out from all the other women who were contestants in the beauty pageant. She had the favor of Haggai. The next time we see her and the term favor used is in verse 15, halfway through, when it says, "And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to the king in the royal residence in the 10th month of Tabith in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor." See how Esther, it seems to be like the way where she goes, she's having favor. In the harem, she finds favor with Haggai. When it's her night to go before the king, she finds favor with all the attendants. She finds favor and pleases the king more than any of the other women. And that word favor is like, it's like a key that tells us that God is watching out for her. See, one of the things that makes Esther unique, you know this if you were here last week, is that it is the only book in the Bible that doesn't reference God at all. And the reason that it doesn't do that is because God is in the background, bringing about his purpose. And these are tragic situations, and God is going to work to bring about his redemption in the life of the people. And so you have to look for how God might be hiding in the background to do this. And that word favor is a key. I want to read something out of Genesis chapter 39. And you guys are studying Genesis on Wednesday night, so this should be somewhat like familiar with you, but in Genesis 39, verse 20 and 21, it says this: Joseph's master took him. So see, Joseph is so much like Esther. He was taken. His life was taken. It says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Somehow God was working in Joseph's life so that he found favor with the people that he interacted with. I think the thing that is true for Joseph is also true for us, right? Or for Esther. She finds favor with the people that she interacts with. It's a clue that says God is working in the background to bring about his purposes, and yet we still don't even know the problem. That's another important thing to remember, is that we live in a time that, or they're in a time that God is bringing about his purposes, and we haven't encountered the problem yet. The same is true for us. Whatever problems that might be coming in our future, God is already working in the background to bring about his purposes.